Hi, and nice to talk to you again. And uh, this is our project and our overview project, and that's the UNESCO chair, and it is tied to the language policy course in linguistics at Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. And this project belongs to the curricularization of extension, linking the course theoretical study to applied hands-on activities. So, uh, welcome to talk to you again, Eve Haque. Um, and I'm going to interview you about your work, if I got it everything right, and what is what you can you teach us uh, today.
Well, it's great to see you again. Thank you. First of all, thanks for having me into this conversation with you to talk a little bit about my work. The kind of work that I'm interested in doing and have been doing is looking at how language policies organize our social world. So a kind of sociology of language policy related to sociolinguistics. In specifically, I have been looking at language policy in Canada and how our policies about language in Canada organize our belonging, create hierarchies of belonging and recognition. But I think that the work I'm doing is also related to work around how language can also, be implicated in different kinds of harm. So I have two kind of separate directions, but related directions, looking at how language organizes our social world. I also feel that the work that I'm doing, although specific to Canada, is applicable for other contexts. So there's thinking I'm trying to do that can be extrapolated to different kinds of contexts beyond Canada.
Yes. Yeah. Furthermore, could you describe the primary aim of the? Yeah, you told us now, but what are your projects that you are working now?
So, my primary aim is really to think about how we can first understand the role of language in organizing our social life, and specifically how we can understand the role of language in the question of harm. So the kinds of violences that emerge from different kinds of linguistic practices and policies around linguistic practices. So the primary aim of my research then is to understand that so that we can ameliorate that, so we can, address those problems. Because I feel that sometimes the kinds of harms that happen through language and policies about language are kind of invisible or seen as not quite direct violence, but rather something that is more abstract and not really real violence. And I think my work is really to say, actually, that's not true. Language, our practices, our beliefs, our policies about language have very material consequences on people's lives. And so when we talk about recognition, belonging, and so on, that these are very material issues, as well as very important theoretical and conceptual discussions.
Yeah, the speechaccess.com. That's what you do.
Yes. So that's a project that looks at academic freedom and the harms of language. And it's a relatively new project, but we have been collecting cases of academic freedom concerns. Our focus, of course, has been Canada and by extension, the US, but also the UK, and looking at some cases globally. And we're always interested in collecting information about more cases, but really looking at how the question of language, speech becomes used to, to constitute harm and to create the conditions for different kinds of harm, and to show that link that I was talking about between language and violence. So we have a website, speechacts.com. Another project that we have a website for is one that is led by my colleague Jeff Bale at OISE, but I'm also the co-principal investigator on that. And it's actually a project that started a long time ago, but it's looking at heritage language discussions in Canada, particularly in Ontario. But this is related to the question of language policies, because Canada, in the end, decided there would only be 2 official languages. And this wasn't that long ago. This was a little over 50 years ago. And therefore, all other languages in Canada, including Indigenous languages, are deemed non-official languages. And so in this project, larch.com, you can see the website. There we have a lot of archival material and interviews looking at what it means to try to maintain non-official languages for particular communities, communities that are considered immigrant, but really many of these communities have been in Canada for over 100 years. And so that, plus the work on language policy in Canada, is a kind of set of projects that I'm doing with the primary aim of revealing how language is related and constitutes our social life and social world.
Could you talk about the official language policy that Canada has nowadays?
Yes, of course. I'm always happy to talk about language policy in Canada. So language policy in Canada is not that old. It is something that really, Canada becomes a nation in 1867, but it isn't until the 1960s that the federal government decides that Canada needs a language policy because they have a concern about national unity. So they have what at that time was one of the longest and quite expensive, one of the most expensive royal commissions at the time. And this is the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. At this so until then, Canada had no official languages, really. Not anything deemed official through policy, explicit language policy. So during this Royal Commission, which kind of starts in 62, 63, and lasts all the way till 1970, many groups who are in Canada, so Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, they French, English, and remember the boundaries between these communities is very complicated. They come and they say, our language is important. It's part of Canada and it should be recognized and as policy. I think what's really interesting and what my initial work was really looking at is how during the Royal Commission, the decision gets made, actually, we are not going to recognize any other language other than English and French. And English and French are what I call the dual white settler languages that sort of underpin a dual white settler nationalism that emerges in the wake of the official language policy of Canada, declaring English and French to be official languages. And in 1969, this is passed. And since then, we are still in a milieu where language policy that is official only recognizes English and French as the official languages in Canada. Now, in 2019, finally, 50 years after the Official Languages Act, we get an Indigenous Languages Act. But the Indigenous Languages Act does not declare Indigenous languages as official, and I have compared these two policies in detail. And the current Indigenous Languages Act is very weak compared to the Official Languages Act and very under-resourced. So, you know, it cannot do the work to maintain and revitalize and reclaim Indigenous languages in the same way, well, first in the way that is necessary to prevent Indigenous language loss, but also to make it the same in terms of its, you know, its linguistic vitality as English and French. So there's this real disparity in language policies in Canada when we are looking or comparing with the dual white settler languages of English and French compared to all the other languages in Canada. And there are over hundreds of languages in Canada, right? Because if you include Indigenous languages, as well as all the non-official languages that different communities have brought over the decades to Canada, you can see if there's no recognition, eventually these languages will, you know, disappear, or there will be incredible language shift leading to language loss.
Yes.
So that's the official policy in Canada. I just want to say, to talk about official language policy means you must consider the language policies, whether they're explicit or not, for non-official languages, because language policies are always interrelated. They always have an effect on other languages, whether they're named explicitly or not.
In your book, multiculturalism within a bilingual framework, you detail how the BNB Commission replaced the politically indefensible concept of founding races with official linguistic communities. How does this historical pivot continue to mask white settler hegemony in today's language policies?
That's an excellent question. And this concept of founding races is a really important one in the terms of reference of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. So there they begin in 1963 by saying their mandate is to look at, you know, how they can create a polity based on the founding races of Canada. If you begin your project, your Royal Commission, with the idea that there already is founding of the nation races, then the task during the commission for other communities who aren't seen as belonging to the founding races to make the case, actually, we also belong, right? And this even more so for Indigenous communities, because frankly, who could be more quote unquote founding than Indigenous communities whose presence on these territories predate by millennia, you know, the arrival of settlers to Canada, particularly white founding settlers. And I want to be really clear that there is often, so we talk a lot about settler colonialism as a way to understand countries such as Canada and the US. This is that European white settlers arrived, there was contact with indigenous peoples, all kinds of cultural genocide and other genocides happened to indigenous peoples. These are also ongoing. And in this way, the settlers sought to replace and make themselves native to these lands that they landed on. And, people like Patrick Wolf, Lorenzo Veracini have really amplified, but many other indigenous scholars, I want to emphasize, have amplified these ideas in terms of what settler colonialism is and how it works in these kinds of polities. So in these terms of reference, in the 1960s, already this thinking is becoming officialized, because as I mentioned, through the Royal Commission, groups come, particularly indigenous groups, and say, wait, we're the first communities of these territories. How are we not part of this founding races group, right? Or founding groups at the very least. And it's a very interesting and kind of tortuous bureaucratic process whereby by 1969, actually in 1967, the Royal Commission decides we're not going to consider the question of indigenous peoples and languages. It's too complicated. So we will leave that for another Royal Commission, and we are going to just consider everything else. And by 1969, that consideration leads to the Official Languages Act, which is, we really think that the founding races, and now they change it, right, to the founding groups are the English and French. So what we see here is this reassertion and officialization of this dual white settler hegemony. And I think there is a lot of discussion in countries such as Canada that these are settler nations, because if you come and settle, then you are a settler. But there's a very important distinction, I think, that needs to be made. And I'm thinking also of non-official language communities here. There's a reason why founding races are found to be the white settler races, because it is the European white settlers who came who are the settlers, because what they did was they replaced existing polities with their own, right? And they made themselves native. And I think, in this, I follow Mahmoud Mamdani's logic that there's a difference between settler and migrant. Migrants often come or are brought over to do labor, and they must adjust and be, integrated or not, right? Many communities remain unintegrated and into the existing polity. So there's a difference between the white settler dualism that emerges. And I think this is the reason why we still maintain this notion, that sort of trace of founding nations, as this continual dual white settler recognition of only English and French as official. To recognize languages as official language belongs to communities and are associated with communities. So to recognize in the present only two, white settler languages as official is telling us something about the kind of polity that the state is interested in maintaining in Canada. And so in this way, the shift from founding races to official language communities continues to mask actually what is the foundational dual white settler hegemony in the state's practices and policies. And we see this in results such as, for example, an Indigenous Languages Act that does not recognize any Indigenous language as official.
Public service, all in English or French?
English or French.
English or French?
English or French. 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 English
Do they?
So I think, yes. So I think what the effort has been to manage, for example, in the territories, is to, so at the federal level, the provincial territorial level, and then more local levels. So if you live locally without the same kind of resources or officialness, there has to be kind of the effort to make really under-resourced local solutions or territorial solutions to these problems, which is to try to say, okay, how can we sort of fill in the gap? So for example, if anybody has to go to the hospital, and we have the right to public health services, but if we cannot speak, enough of the official language to be able to access the health services we need, for example, the hospital or the municipality, or maybe even, the territory, so let's say Northwest Territories, they have to fill in that gap by using their much fewer resources than the federal government to try and provide some translation services. But often these are very neoliberalized, increasingly neoliberalized solutions to what should be fundamentally, federal concerns and solutions, right? And federally funded solutions as well. And so those gaps continue, and we see this in healthcare outcomes, for example, for Indigenous communities. So right now there's a big discussion around federal funding for tuberculosis to address that in the Arctic region, because TB rates are 270% higher than the regular population, the regular non-Indigenous population. And so if the federal government has promised, okay, yeah, this is a big healthcare problem and a gap that emerges out of these differential funding schemes, right? Then we have to give that money, but how will we give it? Will we give it to the territorial state, or will we give it to local authorities whose job it is to administer these agreement funds? So these are the questions that show this kind of gap, right, in terms of not having official recognition. And therefore, so remember, official recognition through policy means that then you can officially properly fund and resource what's needed, right? For example, healthcare services.
Yeah, and I think about the way that the capitalism is eating all of us, and we don't have time, or like leisure time to do anything, and so we don't have enough time to learn another language that is not going to help us in some day-to-day function. So people are going to learn English because all our occidental life is in English.
Yeah, this is a very important point, right? To learn an additional language as an adult is effortful. It's not to say people don't do it, they do it all the time. Most of the planet is multilingual, but it also means that it takes time, but you also have to have access, right, to the resources that will help you acquire language, particularly as a second language. And so that, or as an adult. So I think that is the kind of inequity that's baked into these assumptions that Canada is this dual white settler polity that then has only two white settler languages as official.
Do you see the primary similarities and differences between how official bilingualism functioned in 1969 versus how it operates today?
It's very naturalized that Canada is, bilingual in the present. Like, you know, if someone was asked to describe, oh, how would you, you know, understand Canada? People say, oh, this is a bilingual country, English and French. But it's multicultural. And so what my, you know, my work has been to show that a recognition of Canada as multicultural is really about establishing this hierarchy between, you know, white settler, dual white settler hegemony, like, so that's the hegemony that then kind of subsumes the culture of all the other communities, right? And so multicultural, but they are not given similar kinds of state recognition or resourcing or anything like that.
Going to say before that your 2012 analysis reveals that Canada, bilingual and multicultural policies were not mere gestures of inclusion, but tactical deployments of language and culture. It's strategically designed to preserve white settler hegemony while disavoiding the explicit racialized explosions upon which the nation was built. So,
right. Yeah, I mean, I think the shift, so if we look at the terms of reference of the Royal Commission, it begins by talking explicitly about races, founding races, and the question of races is really foregrounded. By the time we get to the end of the Royal Commission in the 70s, everything has shifted onto the question of culture. And so there's a way in which, for some communities, the English and the French, culture includes language and the importance of maintaining language. Whereas for other communities, culture becomes separated from language. And so this way, the importance of maintaining language and resourcing that maintenance and recognition of those languages becomes bracketed off from this very amorphous notion of culture. And therefore, we can be like, yeah, we recognize non-official language communities' culture. Please enjoy your culture. Whereas, okay, we need to, it's very important to ensure that English and French maintain their official language rights, their official minority language rights. And so we are going to enshrine that in the Constitution explicitly. So 8 sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedom are explicitly about official languages. There's no mention about language for any other group explicitly in the Charter for Indigenous communities, quote unquote, immigrant or non-official language communities in the Charter, or really in the Constitution, right? So it has to be snuck in through case law, through decisions, and it's never sufficient. Even Section 35, which of the Constitution, which guarantees some kind of recognition of Indigenous language rights, it doesn't have the teeth, for example, of UNDRIP, right, which has explicit recognition of Indigenous language rights and therefore responsibilities of the state to maintain them. So what does this all mean? What this all, in the end, the effect is you create this hierarchy of recognition of languages, right? And therefore that in and of itself maintains the racial order that actually the Royal Commission was so explicitly talking about in the 1960s. So I would argue not a lot has changed in terms of the maintenance of that racial order, right? And so we just talk about it in different terms in the question of language and culture and so on. But the hierarchy is maintained, but it's a way to disavow explicit ideas about racial ordering. But, you know, many scholars who do work on race and racism have shown how this, like Balibar, for example, have shown how this shift from talking about race to talking about language is really about maintaining similar kinds of racial orders, but not talking about it in ways that in the present might be seen as distasteful or difficult.
Do you think that is kind of like we talk about it, but we don't do anything? Like we are aware of the fact, but what can we do?
Absolutely. Yes, in some ways, the shift away from speaking explicitly about racial ordering, you know, there's this famous kind of concept of the vertical mosaic in Canada, this from the 1960s and 70s, and we've shifted, this is John Porter's idea, into the present of, oh, we're all just multicultural, Canada's multicultural, it recognizes that we have Indigenous peoples, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, but fundamentally, materially, the hierarchy has not changed, right? So in the end, it continues to maintain that kind of dual white settler hegemony that was, in some ways historically has always been the question of Canada since contact, but it's a very interesting process whereby it became, first of all, officialized and then into the present normalized. And I think the work that I'm trying to do is to do a history of this present where it's normalized by looking at the history and making it feel not so natural, and to say, no, decisions were made and particular discourses were established that pushed out certain groups and created hierarchies of belonging and recognition, which have very material consequences.
Does religion has a say in this? Do they influence in language policies?
That's a really good question. In the first Canadian Constitution, in the first iterations of the Canadian Constitution, there was this Section 133, and these were recognitions in some ways of religious rights, and so it was Catholic, right, versus Protestant, and Canada was quite Catholic and is still considered, a relatively Catholic country because there's a historical Irish community and French community as settlers, white settlers to Canada. And so Section 133 was a kind of attempt to recognize religious rights, but that were really, in some ways, because of the density of the French Canadian population versus the Protestant population, which was English and other, then it became those religious divisions were a way to recognize, or became in some ways de facto, linguistic divisions as well. So I would say, in the kind of constitutive moment of Canada, those religious delineations also in some ways follow these linguistic delineations, or they overlapped with them to some extent.